I'm sitting on the couch and I cocked the shutter and it didn't fire. So I'm sitting there, it's the only camera I had on that day, and I'm thinking to myself, well, what do I do? I'm a long way from home. So opposite me was a guy sitting there and he said to me, I've got the same camera as you've got. And I said, you're kidding. He says, no. So he drove me around to his place, and fair enough, he had the same camera. So I took the lens out of his camera and put it in mine. And I finished that wedding on that day using this guy's lens. Gave it back to him and I had to send mine away to get repaired. So after that, I always took at least 2 other cameras with me. It was a frightening experience to do that. Yes, so that was 1,000,000 to 1 that would have happened. And there was my very first camera, believe it or not. That was a Little Brownie 127. And I paid 21 shillings for that at a chemist in Reservoir. And I think I paid 1 and 6pence for a roll of film. And I took that camera in 1948, I went with the Scouts to Adelaide. And that little camera did very well. So that's where it started, with that little camera. When I worked at Foy's, people were coming in and trading in their old cameras, which I've got photos to show you. And the manager of that department said, we'll just throw these in the tip. And I said, do you mind if I poke through them and take what I can? He said, do it. So I rummaged through all of these boxes and boxes of old cameras that were traded in on cameras like Minolta, Canon, Nikon and so forth, Petri and all those. So I picked the best of the best, and therefore I started a collection of old cameras that I used to display at St Helena where we lived. I had them in a big showcase and I was quite proud of them. So when we had to move from there, I couldn't bring them here, I had no room. So I asked my daughter, I said, would you like to take my collection of these cameras? And she said, I don't want your old cameras, Dad. And so I asked my son, he didn't want them. So I sold them all on eBay and I made a lot of money. And some of the cameras were absolutely pristine, mint cameras. So these are the large format cameras I used to have. That's a Bronica, and that's a Mamiya press. This camera I've still got. It was 1970 I bought the camera, I still own it. So there's one with a rail camera. And that camera is mainly done for industrial purposes. And here's a price list from way back in 1975. Yeah, I used to always have the Scots thistle. So that's when I was at Gulf Avenue. And the most astounding thing is when you look at the prices that was being charged then to what they are now, the difference is amazing. A full 12-page bridal album, 10 by 8, you'd be looking at about $145 for the whole album. So, and these are the cameras that I sold. No one wanted them, and they were in all pristine condition. And this is the collection I used to have, all these cameras. Collectors used to come and buy them from me. This one here is a rare camera. Kodak only made this for 6 months, so I had all the history of that written out. And it used to have what they call a rack and pinion focusing system on this. And they only made that camera for 6 months, and a lady in Perth bought that. And about a couple of months later, she wrote me a lovely letter to say that is now in a glass case in the entrance of their establishment. So all these cameras that I did own have now been sold to collectors. But they are in fantastic condition. This is the very, very first camera from Minolta to come into Australia in 1953, a little rangefinder camera. That was the second camera I used for weddings. I sold the S and bought the 3. There's yours truly sitting in his darkroom. And here is a large, very large format camera, folding camera. Flexorette, that's gone. So these are the cameras I used to use. That was for industrial work, and that was a wedding camera. Very difficult to use, very big. I started off using a Minolta cord, which is 2 1/4 square. I had actually all rolly cords and rolly flexes, which I used to use. I then moved into 6x4/5, which was Mamiya and Bronica. I found these cameras okay, but not as good as a 6x4/5. The press camera was a Mamiya, and that was a 6x7. That was a much larger format. It's a Leica 3F that I bought back in 1959. I have attached to the top a viewfinder which takes into 135, 35mm, 28mm. Different lenses you can attach. They're a screw type lens. So I've got the history of all the Leica cameras, and today they are a very, very good camera. But me, I like Nikon. I'm a Nikon man through and through. This particular brand is Nikko, and they eventually became Yashica. They changed companies. This is another one I bought way back in 1960. It is one of the original Nikons. And this is a lens that I purchased around about the 1970, mid-70s. That's a 50 to 300mm 4.5 lens. It was one of the very first lenses in this size that Nikon produced. So this is one of the last cameras I used. It's still a film camera, and that was one of Nikon's top cameras. That's an F5. After that, the last film camera Nikon ever produced was an F6, which I didn't get, but I've still got my F5, and that was a good camera for weddings. And I also had an F4, which was produced around about 1988, 1999, 1988. So that's a Nikon 4, F4, beautiful camera with the data back on it. So these are the last cameras I ever used in doing weddings. Gentleman that taught me so much, his name was Dick Barnes. He was an Englishman, and I worked with him at Foy's, and when I was doing weddings, in fact he was the one who actually started me off doing weddings. Now I can tell you a story that is true. When 32 ASA Kodacolor came out, no one was taking colour. This is about 1958 when Kodacolor first came out, very slow film. And Dick said to me, why don't you go and do a couple of weddings and take 12 photos at one and 12 at another and see how they go. Everything was fine, but every time you saw the bride, she had a blue hue in her dress, and the guys had white shirts that had blue in it. So it was a light bluey coloured in their whites. And we didn't like that. Now, all credit goes to Dick. He got out a colour wheel and worked out that the equipment that I was using was a National flash gun, which was quite large head, and it was basically meant for black and white. So what it was doing, it was blowing out a light that gave this blue hue. So in his wisdom, he said, what we'll do, we'll take a yellow filter and put it over the tube, which we did. And we set it all up that way, so the flash would still operate, but the main light coming out the centre would be then a yellowish light, right? The first results we got back from Kodak was unbelievable. The whites were knockout. They were white, white, white. So we were on the right track. So this is what we did. Every wedding I did, the brides would come out, the guys' shirts would come out with this beautiful pure white shirts and beautiful white gowns. And not only that, the lace that was on the girls' dresses was more noticeable. You could see it. So about 5 months later, 6 months later, we had a guy that turned up at the counter, and he said to Dick Barnes, he said, you have a guy here called McLaren. Do you know him? And Dick said, we do. He works here. So he called me out, and this guy turned out to be from the Kodak and Lonsdale Street experimental division. So he started to talk to us about why, out of all the film that was getting back from all over the place, we were the only ones who was coming back with white dresses. So we started to tell him exactly what we were doing. So he thanked us very much and went away. True story. 12 months later, Kodak released the gold tube flash guns. And if you do your history, you can go back and do it. And this is the truth. And Dick and I turned to each other and we said, boy, were we taken. You know, we were the, well, not me so much, but Dick was the one who he actually came up with the theory of how we can get rid of this blue. And he did, and we got it. And Kodak come and picked our brains, and yep, 12 months later. Now they've corrected all that. They've actually changed the formula to that. But for that period of time, 12 months later, Kodak released their new flash guns with gold tubes. Weddings today are very different. I mean, my very first wedding I ever did was with Joe Addersack. It was Reservoir Studios. And our biggest problem in those days was rain. When it rained, where do you take photos? Joe said to me, don't worry about it. He had a studio. I went in with him. We went into his particular part he had, and at the back was all these curtains, so you could draw them across and you could have a scene from the Mediterranean, all these different scenes. So you drew the screen across, and then you had velvet curtains. So you took them all the weddings were taken inside in studios, right? And it was later, probably around about the 1965, that part that we decided we'd start taking weddings in gardens. So we used to go to all these different gardens to take wedding photographs. And in those days it was slower in the sense that you were using film and you only had so many photos you could take. And a large format camera, you would only take 3 or 4 rolls on that day, which only took about 12 photographs on each roll. So you had to be very, very precise what photographs you took in that wedding. Not like a digital camera, you can burn it away, you could do 300 or 400 photos and no problem. In those days, film, large format, most cameras maybe 12 exposure, maybe 6x4.5, you get 16. So you're really restricted to what photographs you take, okay, because of numbers. So you used to go off to these gardens and you'd find a place that was just suitable for giving nice backgrounds, and you'd set your bridal group up and start to take photographs. Today, it's more relaxed in the sense that they don't dress up as like they did in the 60s, 70s and maybe 80s. You today can go in pretty casual, nice, clean, casual, you know, clothing. And I've been to some of the modern ones and yeah, they're different, they're very different. Today, I've noticed that most photographers use digital 35mm size or large format, that size, you know, full frame. The ones I've seen doing it, I've not seen any do it with what I consider a medium format cameras. They're always 35mm. What you've got, the Sony. So they must be happy with it. Yeah. There's so many things to tell you, in as much that when I retired, my father used to do carpentry, right? So I took up in my workshop down underneath the garage I had built up a very large workshop doing woodwork, and I made a lot of product. Potato boxes, Christmas sleigh. I took all my father's equipment and added a lot more to what I had and produced all this stuff. I used to go to markets and sell it all. Yeah, but that was the last one I ever did, and she was absolutely thrilled to pieces when she got it. That was big. That was quite large. It was about 5 foot across in the old term, so it was quite a large unit. 6 or 7 years I did all this woodwork, and then Velma, my wife, decided that she wanted to leave where we were, which was St Helena, and she had her eyes set on going to a retirement village. So unfortunately, first of all, I lost my dark room, right? My dark room was, I'd done all that, so I sold all that equipment, and then I lost all my woodwork equipment to come here because I couldn't. There was nowhere to bring all that over here. So, yeah. So from then, when I came here, I decided to turn my hand to doing football, soccer, and cricket. So that's what I still do today. Unfortunately, COVID's taken its time on that, but that's what I do now is soccer, cricket, and football. Photos of the local teams. Yeah. So when I go for football, I use high speed, and so this is what you get. So you take about 11 shots. So in that 11 shots, you'll get the one that you want. So that's the difference between digital and film. You could do it in film on the F5. You could do it, but you just sit and film so quickly. Whereas this, you just take all those photos rapidly, and you can pick out the best of the best. So that's the best part about digital. You can, if you've got a big enough card in it, you just keep turning away. And one day I'm standing outside Rudd's in High Street and David Street, Preston, where we used to all take our motorbikes. I had a Matchless 500, and we're standing outside, and there there's two people coming down the street in David Street, and it happened to be Velma and her mother, and it was her 17th birthday. So as they came past, she told us it was her 17th birthday and gave us all a kiss. But she gave me a long enduring kiss. Yes, and if you ever believe love at first sight, I'm telling you, it happened to me. So anyhow, she went round the corner to where they were going to a little library, and on the way back she passed us and said good night and went up the street. And I turned to me 6 mates at that time were there, and I said, I'm going to ask her out. And they all laughed. They all thought it was a great joke. But on the Wednesday night, I plucked up enough courage to go up and knock on the front door of this house. And her mother came to the door, and I said, I met you the other night, Mrs. Murray, and I said, your daughter Velma. And I said, I've come up to see if I could just talk to Val. So she proceeded out and got Val to come to the front door, and I started to talk to Val. And as I say, I have no idea what I said, but in the process, I must have said, would you go out with me? And at that time I had out in the front street my new little Austin A30, and Velma looked over my shoulder and saw, got a car, got a motorbike, I'll be in this. So she said yes, so we proceeded to go out, and for 62 years we were together. So if you're a believer of love at first sight, I can honestly say that was the girl that won my heart that day. So this is Velma on her 17th birthday. This is what she looked like. She had very bobbed hair, but she was a beauty to me. And this is when we were first engaged over here. The love of my life. We always, and still do, have dress-ups, right? So this is high society night, and if you take all the money at the bottom down there. So this is Velma and my sister Barbara. This is here, this is yours truly standing here. And we called each other, the Duchess Scarlet was Barbara, Countess de Silva is June, Lady and Lord Stuff It All is Val and I. This is another, I've had a very colourful career. Now, when Velma passed away, my sister took me down to her place, and she's a country cook, so she taught me how to cook. So from that time on, we've got about 3 or 4 guys here. They've all got their wives who have now passed away. So I used to bring them up here and I'd cook for them. So this is what I do, and I'm starting that again now that COVID is not over, but at least we can move around again a bit better. So these are all the things I used to do, and still do.
Thank you, Ray.
Thank you.
Thank you. I'll come back. For more stories.
Oh, there's a lot more stories. There really is. You
Yeah.
know, I've had a very. Do you mind if I turn the light?